All right, I think we can get started. Welcome everybody to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. We're excited to welcome new participants as well as those of you who were able to attend our conference in the past. We hope you got to be part of our opening plenary session, but if you missed that or wish you could see another breakout panel that's happening right now, no problem. All of the presentations are recorded and will be available on our conference website. I'm Michael Hoffmeister, and I'm very happy you are here at this breakout session, Historical Trauma, Understanding Its Impacts, How to Heal, and How to Move Forward with Niquanna Barnett. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the Wunkshik or Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejope, or Four Lakes. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you are watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations, or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across this continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into action in our own work in communities once this conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and move forward toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. A few details before we get started. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. We also know many of you are curious about CEUs that you registered for. You're all set. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email, either because you are already logged on in Zoom or because you provided those upon entering. This allows us to verify attendance. So you will get CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed in the coming weeks. Your cameras and your microphones will remain muted. We also have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenter. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will not be able to get to all questions submitted. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Niquanna Barnett. Niquanna is a marriage and family therapist currently practicing at Orion Family Services in Madison, Wisconsin. She attended Carroll University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in psychology, and then later went on to attend Capella University, where she earned her master's degree in marriage and family therapy. She also completed certificates in play therapy and compulsive addictions at Capella University. Niquanna has presented on historical trauma 2 years in a row for the CHHSM annual conference presented at Carroll University, and has also presented for several other agencies in Wisconsin, as well as an agency in Arizona. She most recently helped develop and leads the Inclusivity, Diversity, and Equity Advisory Board at her agency. Please join me in welcoming Niquanna.
Thank you. Hello and welcome, everyone. I am so glad that you're going to join me for this very informative topic. I am going to share my screen and we're going to get started. And so just bear with me a little bit on the technology. So like they said, this topic is on historical trauma and understanding its impacts, how to heal, and how to move forward. So today, what we're going to do is my hope is to be able to provide you more with information in regards to historical trauma. We're going to hopefully be able to get into some microaggressions and implicit biases as well too, and start the conversation on healing and moving forward. We will learn what historical trauma is, who is affected by it, how microaggressions are tied into historical trauma, how do we move forward. I first want to just say, I want to let everyone know I am by no means like an expert in historical trauma. I did not go to school and study it. My education about historical trauma came from educating myself and from my own experience. As a therapist, the work that we do is we do what's called intensive in-home therapy. So we meet people where they are at. And being an African-American clinician, we service all of southeastern Wisconsin and sometimes put in spaces that aren't always open and welcoming to people that look like me. And I was working with a family with my co-therapist at the time. And we went and we saw, and the young girl we were working with spit on me. And it was just I always tell people, and I don't exaggerate when I say it, to this day, I can remember exactly what I had on. I can remember exactly what park we were at. I can remember exactly how it smelled, what we were doing. And it just resonated so strong with me. And I was so angry and upset that I couldn't even finish the session. And then I was very angry and upset and disappointed in myself. Like, why did that bother me so much? And I never spoke about it, with my co-therapist. We both just kind of got in the car and drove away in silence. Me, I think out of anger, and I think her out of embarrassment, like, why would this girl do this? And then we were at a conference and we were talking about some things, and the speaker was talking about how our past can sometimes affect who we are. And my executive director, who was my supervisor at the time, was at my table with me across from me. And I bravely raised my hand and shared the story about what happened to me. And this woman said, that's like historical trauma, because you have to think about the things that happened to our people in the past and how it can still resonate in our body and our DNA. And tears came to my eyes because there was just a sense of relief for me, because I'm like, I'm not a bad therapist. And I understand what happened. And then there was just this sense of, why was I never taught about this in school? Because given the population that I work with, this is extremely important. So then I set out to educate myself on it. So before we get started, I first want to talk to you guys about Resmaa Menakem. He has a book called My Grandmother's Hands, which is racialized trauma and the pathways to mending our hearts and healing our bodies. And in the beginning of his book, he has what's a little bit of a mindfulness thing. And I wanted to share this with you because I wanted you to be aware of what you may feel as we go through this presentation. And as you may watch other presentations throughout today, and if you're attending next Friday. So it says, if you have a white body, there might be times that you constrict in order to protect you from some of the truth you'll encounter. This constriction will be followed by a thought such as, I'm not like that, I'm a good person. When this occurs, just notice what you're experiencing without doing anything about it. Don't try to undo the constriction. Don't try to hold on to it either. Just watch your body closely and notice the sensations, impulses, and emotions that arise. If you have a Black body or other dark body, there will be times when your body will experience a sudden shock of recognition or understanding. Things you hadn't fully grasped before may suddenly become clear. This might be followed by a rush of energy in the form of joy or anger or outrage or a felt sense of clarity and rightness. Let yourself experience these sensations fully, but don't hang on to them. And also, just be aware, there's going to be some images. We're going to watch a little video, and it may be hard to watch, but part of that is understanding what people of color, when they're being triggered, what their body feels like. So just be aware of that. And if you need to step away, please do. So we're going to start about how our past continues to come and erode into our future and how that all ties into historical trauma. So let's first start with August 28th, 1955. A young Emmett Till went down to Mississippi to visit his family. And during that time, Emmett Till was accused of whistling at a white woman and saying inappropriate things. And at that time, Emmett Till was taken away from his family and was later found in a Tallahatchie River, where he had been lynched with a cotton gin tied around his neck, shot, and severely beaten. Emmett Till's mother fought so hard to have his body returned to Chicago after many people down there tried to stop his body from coming and even told his uncle to bury him that day and tried not to do an autopsy. And Mamie Till's words rung out of, "Let them see, let them see." She wanted the world to see what had happened to her son. And the trial then started a little bit later. And as we all know, they did not get the justice that they deserved. Emmett Till's uncle or great uncle, Moses Wright, was the first man to ever speak up against a white man in the trial. Spoke up so much that he had to then leave his home, his land that he owned, because he was afraid for his life. And those are similarities to what we still see today. Fast forward 65 years, May 26, 2020. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the world stood by with a bated breath as we watched a young Darnella Frazier record what could only be determined as a lynching of George Floyd. Darnella Frazier was so brave to stay and keep recording, although things were being said to her and she was being told to leave. Derek Chauvin kneeled on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in what has been determined as a new age form of lynching. 65 years later, and nothing has changed. 65 years later, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill still has not been passed. So as we talk about historical trauma, it's important to look at the things that have happened in the past that still affect the future. So we look at these pictures that are coming up of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and what can be determined as the civil rights movement of the 2000s. Not much has changed. We have large protests, police standoffs, and the murder and killing of Black men and Black women. We have to understand the past and the effect that it has had on people of color in order to make changes in the future. So before we go into historical trauma, I want to give you all just a little bit of basis understanding of trauma, because I think everyone in here is social workers, but I'm not sure, so I'm just going to provide a little bit of understanding about it. So as we know, trauma can be defined as a psychological emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. It is important to note that not everyone will experience a traumatic event the same way. So for example, I could be in a car accident with my sister and it could turn my sister into being like, I can never drive in a car again. I'm just so terrified of being in a car, and I could just go on with my everyday life. Trauma is felt in the nervous system and not in the event. Many people believe that there are 3 defining traumas: complex, PTSD, and developmental, but many overlook historical trauma and the impact it has had on Native Americans, African Americans, and other ethnic groups. A book that I often like to refer to is by Bessel van der Kolk, called The Body Keeps the Score. It says emotions literally have an anatomical mapping in the brain necessary for survival. That is to say, the emotion of fear has a very specific neural circuitry etched in the brain corresponding to specific physical sensations from various parts of the body. So that is important because when we're going through events that are historically shaped, for example, for me, I was born in 1978, but I can still be affected by something that happened during the civil rights movement in 1960, 1965, during events that happened in slavery, because those untreated events are passed down from generation to generation, and we still feel those in our body. I had a discussion once before with someone, and a young man said, "Oh, great, you're just going to give people an excuse to be able to do the things they want to do because you're going to say it's in their DNA." This is by no means an excuse for anything, but this is just saying to have an understanding, to be able to understand why sometimes our reactions are so loud. You know, I think back to being afraid of a dog. never had anything happen to me with a dog, but I was afraid of dogs. But where that comes from is if you look in history of how often, people of color had dogs sicked on them as a means of trying to control them, that innate fear lives in them. And that gets passed on genetically and through other different traits from our parents. So now I'm going to have you guys watch. Go ahead.
Just jump in here quick.
Yes,
There
yes.
are some black bars that are on the top of the screen that we're seeing. It looks like there may be some other windows open obstructing the view. Do you have anything else open on your computer? Maybe if you do, just close them. And yes, there you go. They're going away now.
Okay. Are they gone now? Are we good to go?
There's still one in the very top corner.
Yeah, I don't see it on my end. It's
okay. Okay, I think it's fine for now. It's not obstructing too much of the view of the slide. Just wanted to see if we could resolve, but you're good to go now. Thank you.
Okay, so now what I'm going to have you all do is I'm going to have you guys watch a little bit of a video. And in watching this video, I want you to just be aware of your body and the sensations that your body is feeling. We're just going to watch a few minutes of it. So as we watch that video, I'm pretty sure a lot of people had a lot of different sensations going through their body. I know for me, I always feel very tense. I clench my teeth. And anyone that's affected by that will probably feel it all throughout their body. But people of color multiply that feeling times 10. So in order for something to be considered a historically traumatic event, there has to have been genocide, slavery, massacre, forced relocation, pandemics, and prohibition of cultural practices. So when we talk about historically traumatic events, think events such as the Auschwitz, the Jewish concentration camps, Native American kids being forced to be at boarding schools, Japanese camps after Pearl Harbor, slavery, And what many is saying is happening today is the border crisis issue, where many children of Hispanic descent still remain in concentration camps, is what some want to call them down there. And the key thing to remember about historical trauma is that the effects of the trauma inflicted on the groups of people because of their race, creed, and ethnicity linger on in the souls of their descendants. So when we talk about historical trauma defined, again, it's a multi-generational trauma that's experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. As we stated before, it's related to major events, forced migration, the Holocaust, the violent colonization of Native Americans. One thing that is important to note is that not all people in a subgroup will experience the effects of historical trauma, but those that it does affect will affect them in significant ways. Many will experience low self-esteem, depression, self-destructive behavior, significant risk for violence or aggressive behavior, substance abuse, addiction and misuse, high rates of suicide, domestic violence, and cardiovascular disease. So when we think about historical trauma, you think about surviving slavery and racial violence. So let's say Nicole's great-great-grandparents survived slavery and racial violence in the American South. But because of what they went through and the lack of support that they received in their community, it got passed on through the generations. And as it was getting passed on through the generations, it built things such as abandonment, domestic violence, low self-esteem, PTSD, and alcoholism. So many people that live in communities that have unaddressed grief and trauma have significant health issues. I don't know if anybody's ever familiar with the ACE study here, but if you're not familiar with the ACE study, study is something that I would recommend that you look up. ACE is Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it looks at the relationship between early childhood trauma and health and well-being problems later in life. Now, if we were to do this with, I guess they'd be considered boomers. I'm not very up on which generation is what, but I bet their ACE scores would be high. And then if you do this with children of boomers, their ACE score is going to be high as well too, because a lot of those survival techniques that they had were passed down to them. Historical trauma can also affect the way people parent. It can contribute to behavioral problems in children. Communities that are most significantly affected are Native Americans, African Americans, Japanese Americans, and Jewish Americans and descendants of the Holocaust. And as I stated before, due to the recent racial profiling, segregation, and separation at the border, we will be adding Hispanic Americans to that list as well. Hispanic Americans are currently being exposed and historical trauma is forming in them. They're being separated at the border from their families. Children are being fostered off into homes, almost similar to when Native Americans were fostered off into boarding school. They're going into homes that don't know anything about them, don't know anything about their religion, their culture, and they're going to be forced to assimilate to the majority of culture, thus losing who they are. So some core concepts of historical trauma. In historical trauma, what it really means is also that the dominant culture perpetuates mass trauma on a population. And during this, it causes devastation in certain areas. There's cultural, familial, economic, and societal devastation. Some of those devastations even come through in the policies that were formed to help people. For example, Section 8 was formed to help people, but Section 8 is really a familial devastation. And I know sometimes people go, well, how is Section 8 causing familial devastation? But if you look at one of the first rules about Section 8 is that a man cannot live in the home if you're receiving Section 8. And as for many people, the head of the household is the male. And when Section 8 first started out, it was most widely received and used by people of color. Thus, that created familial devastation because you were separating families. And that started this narrative of it's okay to be a single parent, it's okay to have this single household. And the males were no longer in the home and they were put out. And if you look, even in some of today's advertising, that message is still sent. I remember that there was a Target ad And there was, a white couple, Asian couple, and when it got to the black couple, the black person, it was only the mother and her kids. So you just have to think about how those messages are still being perpetuated in today's society. Cultural devastation is when, our culture is taken from us. Again, just think about, slavery, when you're ripped from your land and you're forced to take on understanding and learning the culture of the majority, and they're not taking any time to learn and know about you. Economic devastation is the complete breakdown of the economic system. So when we talk about economic devastation, think Black Wall Street. So Black Wall Street happened in Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was a thriving community of African Americans. They had over 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private airplanes, a hospital, a bank, and its own school system. Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Black Wall Street was devastated on May 31st to June 1st after there was an incident, which there's many different accounts about what happened on this elevator. But because of what happened, an angry white mob descended upon them and devastated this land. They never fully recovered. And there are many people to this day that are still feeling the effects from this. I don't know if people saw, but most recently there was the sister and brother who were 101 and I believe 102 that were descendants from this. And they still talked about the pain and anguish that they felt. They talked about all that they lost from this incident. Other core concepts to remember to think about too is that systemic racism falls into the category also of mass trauma. This trauma has continued on for decades and still happens today. When we talk about systemic racism, what you have to think about is like redlining is a big issue in systemic racism. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and when people see pictures about Milwaukee, they think, oh, it's so racially diverse. But in actuality, Milwaukee is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. And part of that is due to redlining. And what redlining was, it was started to basically keep African Americans and other non-whites out of areas that were highly populated by whites. It also continues to happen in school systems. Schools that fell into those areas received a lack of support, lack of services. That's why they say it's really important today to continue to fill out your census to get the services and things that those schools need. Historical trauma is believed to be passed in many ways. Generations that have experienced these traumatic events create a pathway that results in present generation being at higher risk of experiencing mental and physical distress. It can be passed on through our DNA and through traits children learn from their parents. It can be passed on to future generations through environmental, psychological factors, prejudice, racism, and discrimination. One of the things to think about, especially if you're working with families, that if a parent is emotionally numb or disassociating during traumatic reliving, they are not able to help their children appropriately develop a good sense of self, and they are also passing those negative traits on. Historical traumatic events can live in our bodies, and even though we may not have directly experienced that event, it can still have a significant effect on us. So historical trauma was first studied with Native Americans. The study of historical trauma in Native American culture can be attributed to Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. So when Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart was doing her studies, historical trauma, she described it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across a generation emanating from massive group trauma experiences. So massive group trauma experiences, again, think the forced removal of many Native Americans into boarding schools away from their families. And as we know right now, currently, if anyone is familiar with the group Illuminatives, if not, it's one that I would highly encourage you to look up. They've been doing a lot of work about historical trauma and things that have happened. And one of the things they've been really big about is looking into what happened at these boarding schools. Because as we know, many would come in, they'd have their hair cut, they would receive abuse if they spoke their native language. They were forced to practice a religion that was unknown to them. They were not allowed to practice their own traditions as well too. Native Americans have experienced continuous cycles of genocide and disenfranchisement. Historical trauma has affected Native Americans in many ways. Some experience survivor guilt, depression, alcoholism, low self-esteem, anger, domestic violence, and substance abuse. Braveheart notes that many tribes have not been able to resolve their grief due to the fact that there has been federal prohibitions against some of their ceremonial practices and the continued takeover of sacred land. So think when we talk about continued takeover of sacred land, it was just only a couple of years ago that they're trying to put that pipeline through Standing Rock, and that would have been taken over land from them. And I know in some places they still cannot practice some of their ceremonial events that would help with that healing. So how do we help the Native American cultures heal from this? Braveheart, and during her research with tribal communities, developed the historical trauma intervention model. The model relies on 4 components to foster healing from the grief. We have to first confront the history, understand the trauma and its effects, releasing the pain, and transcending the trauma. When I did this topic a couple of years ago at the Chisholm annual conference, there is actually an agency that was there from South Dakota. And they had informed me, Bruce Perry, who anyone in the human services world is very familiar with Bruce Perry, was actually doing some trauma work and doing brain mapping and trying to introduce new healing rituals with them. This is work that is a long time coming. Unfortunately, I have not been privy to how that's turned out, but I'm, really glad to see that some of this work is being done. With Bruce Perry bringing in new healing rituals, it's going to be helpful because they're going to be able to reconnect to past rituals and help usher back in this ability to rewrite their narratives and begin to teach the rituals to the younger generation. Historical trauma in African Americans. So African Americans have experienced generations of slavery, segregation, and institutionalized racism that has contributed to physical, psychological, and spiritual trauma. For many African Americans, being descendants of enslaved Africans, the dynamics of slavery itself, the institutionalized segregation, and violence that followed emancipation and ongoing struggle for racial justice continue to have a multifaceted impact on Native Americans. Unaddressed historical trauma can shape how we respond to current traumatic events. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Tamika D. Mallory, but she is a very active social activist. And she went and spoke at George Floyd's protests, and they were asking her about the looting and the rioting. And one thing that she said was, "We were doing what we were taught." And someone asked her, "What did you mean by that?" And she said, "These events have happened to us in our past and have continued to be heaped upon us. So all we're doing is responding in how we were taught." And these are things that have remained unaddressed in our community. Dr. Joy DeGruy coined the phrase post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she said many African Americans suffer from post-traumatic slave syndrome. According to DeGruy, slavery has yielded stressors that were both disturbing and traumatic, exacting a wound upon the African American psyche, which continues to fester. African Americans continue to have daily reminders of racial discrimination, and it can continue to exacerbate our trauma responses. So I'm going to have a little video that's important for you guys to watch from Dr. DeGruy.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, "Oh my God, that happened so long ago." We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impacts. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course. There's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
Niquanna, we've had a few questions come in. Is this a good time?
Yes, it's perfect. Mhm.
All right. So two of these questions go back a little to a little earlier in the presentation. One person is asking if you can talk a little bit more about, they're referring to the scenario you talked about with a Black person having an innate fear of dogs, and how that's related to historical trauma. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. So what that is if you look back in society and if you look at pictures, a lot of the times when there was like peaceful protest or there was people out in the communities, dogs were used as a way to capture Black people. So, the first way police were started were the slave catchers. They were sent out to bring back the slaves that had tried to escape. And their means of bringing them back, one was using dogs. And the dogs weren't just used to sniff them out and bring them back. They were used to viciously attack them, to also try to teach them, like, you've been attacked by this dog. You don't want this to happen again, so don't leave. And that fear of the dogs continuously is passed on because when people would, African Americans would see dogs, it just would create an innate sense of fear for them. I use that as an example because, it even happened to me. I never had an issue with a dog, but the moment I'd see a dog, there'd just be fear, and never understood why I had this just innate fear of dog. And it's just a trait that has been passed along just due to the abuse that we had received by people using dogs as a means to attack.
Okay, thank you. Another one was asking about the conversation at the topic around Section 8, and wondering if you're talking about the legal backgrounds of individuals were restricting their ability to participate in the program, or if there were some other rules at the beginning of the program that were restricting the availability.
So I can say that I do know that some, states are trying to enact some federal changes with that. But when Section 8 was first stated in, it had nothing to do with any legal background whatsoever. The first rule was just that it could only be the mother and that child living there. The head of the household, which was the male, was not allowed to live there. I know in Wisconsin, just with some families that I work with that have Section 8, that still remains the same unless they're giving special, I remember working with one family. The mother was applying and trying to get the father added on as well too, but I know that does still remain the same.
Okay. And then one more question. Can you talk a bit about the interface or connection or not between historical trauma and post-traumatic slave syndrome?
So the interconnection with it is they're one and the same, but Dr. Joy Gride coined the phrase post-traumatic slave syndrome because a lot of the events that most affected African Americans started at slavery. And so there's things such as you heard her mention, she said, from the way we eat, from the way we interact with people. One thing that, I often point out is just even sometimes when social services gets involved, and one of the key things we see is about like parentification in children. And that could, that really stems from slavery time because mom was forced to take care of the slave master's children first. And so her kids were forced to take care of the younger kids, do things on their own. And one thing that I've noticed, especially in African American communities, is we really talk about how our kids can eat table food early when that's really not a normal thing. That's a slavery thing because the mother's milk would be dried up because she was forced to feed, the slave master's child first. And then they had to drink like sugar water or eat the food. So that's how it's intertwined because those events, just like the historically traumatic events, can still impact and play roles in our lives today.
Great. And then there's one more. You may get to it in the remainder of your presentation, but one of the participants is asking, what, if anything, can white practitioners do to mediate the reality of racial trauma when working with Black or Indigenous clients?
And I do get to that.
Okay, so we'll put a pin on that one, and then look forward to hearing the answer to that.
Well, one thing I can say with that is that the first thing is we have to, if you're, white practitioner and you're working, with minorities, you first have to just acknowledge that you have a privilege. And not saying that you came from this great world. Everyone knows just because you're white doesn't mean you were rich and have fancy cars and big houses and things like that. But what it means is that you were just afforded a privilege because of the color of your skin that others were not afforded. So when working with them, you just have to first come in and just acknowledge, like, I have this privilege that you did not have, and acknowledge that you were given advances in the world that they may not have been given simply because of the color of their skin. And one thing I often say is we have to get comfortable in the uncomfortable. And what that means for me is that a lot of times we feel like if I just avoid talking about this, if I don't bring it up, it's not going to be an issue. And the reality is that it's there. Because, when working with white clinicians, we know, like, we have to go and talk about our background, and so that there can be a little bit more understanding. Whereas if working with a clinician of color, you can come in and be like, okay, you already have that basic understanding of what I'm going through. So being uncomfortable with that and being like, I know that I don't always understand what you're going through, but I'm here to learn. And in walking through this walk with you, not only are you going to help me, but I'm going to be able to help you as well too. And that does tie in, because one thing that the grad talked about is like that ongoing struggle for racial justice. For many people, they said civil rights was resolved, ended in 1965. I firmly believe that we are still in a fight for civil rights. If civil rights was resolved and done in 1965, we wouldn't see parallels of what happened to Emmett Till happening today to George Floyd. We wouldn't see parallels of like that man that was walking down the street being hit and kicked. And that parallel could be tied to Ahmaud Arbery, who was out just trying to go for a jog and was murdered. So we wouldn't see issues like that. We wouldn't see issues of where there is still racism in police forces, in our practices that we use. Most recently I saw an officer, a woman, who was working alongside her sergeant, and she tried to intervene, and the sergeant tried to choke her from intervening because, he's like, you can't stop me. This is how we're supposed to treat these people. So if civil rights had ended, we would not still be having experiences like this. That's why she said we have this ongoing struggle of racial justice. When I think about civil rights, and, as we know, Black History Month starts February 1st. Black History Month has only been recently most acknowledged. I believe it was in 1970s by President Ford. So it hasn't even been active for over 50 years yet. I think I'm just a couple of years younger than how long Black History Month has been acknowledged. And when we think about civil rights time, for many of us, our parents grew up in that time. That's why it's also important that we continue to try to advocate for critical race theory to be taught. I look at the fact that both of my parents were born in 1960. They were 5, 6, 7 years old at the height of civil rights. They clearly remember things. And there's clearly a lot of unresolved trauma that they experienced that they have passed on to myself and my sister. One of the things that Dr. Joyda talked about was the de-integrating. It is very common in African-American families for the parents to be proud of their kids, but they don't say it because that thought of the slavery time, like, if I say how good this kid is, you're going to come and you're going to take them away. It's not saying I love you, not being told you're doing a great job because they want to keep the kids. They don't want anything to happen to them. And, working to try to get out of that and get out of that mindset is having to have mental health as well, too. So again, as we said, Dr. DeGrye's post-traumatic slave syndrome theory takes into the account the development of survival adaptations necessary for ending the hostile slavery environment and how these adaptations, both positive and negative, continue to be reflected in African American behaviors and beliefs. Those survival adaptations go back as far as like the way we even braided our hair. And I know that people have seen how hairstyles have been such a big issue. And there's even laws being put in place now to say you can't discriminate because of hair. What a lot of people don't know is the way we used to braid our hair during slavery times often was a map for the Underground Railroad. The cornrows that we braided, or the plaits as sometimes they were called, told you how to get from A to B. And also what often happened was seeds were put in those braids. So when you made it to freedom, you got there, you have to start off on your own. I don't have any food, I don't have any of this. And those seeds would be there so that you could take those seeds out of your braids and start to plant and start a future for your family. So unaddressed trauma of slavery has resulted in behaviors such as low or vacant self-esteem, ever-present anger, racist socialization, all of which can undermine the survivability to be successful. It's also important to note that microaggressions, which I hope we'll be able to get to, will play a role in this as well too. It's important to note that post-traumatic slave syndrome also acknowledges the fact that African Americans are resilient and resourceful, which helped us survive slavery and is helpful in healing today. Resiliency is a big key thing when it comes to dealing with historical trauma and post-traumatic slave syndrome. Reminding people that they are resilient, reminding them that they can bounce back from these things, providing them the education and letting them know what you're feeling is normal. What you're feeling is okay. We're going to process through this. We're going to work through this. And that's also where representation matters too. Not saying that a non-person of color can't do this work, but sometimes having someone that looks like you is really beneficial, or being able to be educated and work with someone of color that can help you to be able to better understand the community that you're working with. When working with African Americans and trying to heal from historical trauma, again, you first have to acknowledge the history of what happened and what continues to happen to marginalize our communities, and build on family relationships, strong communities, and faith in African American communities. So how does unaddressed trauma affect African Americans today? Again, as we stated, the past of trauma can be rooted from the family unit itself or found in society via current discrimination and oppression. The stigma of mental health continues to be passed along, and that has been probably one of the biggest barriers for people of color, not just African Americans, but Hispanic Americans, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, Hmong Americans, from addressing their trauma. Because for many of them, receiving mental health help is something that rich white people are able to get. And so for them, it's like, we can't address our trauma because this is something that isn't meant for us. And then the stigma of, if you see a therapist, you're crazy, there's something wrong with you. So we have to also address that stigma. We have to get rid of those, that's only for if you have this, that's only for if you have that, and let people know that it's okay to go and talk about these things. And again, we have to be able to build these systems in our community. Anybody that's probably, I don't know if where people are from, but in Milwaukee, there's a new group therapy called Black Space. And it has been very essential in helping bring forward, and breaking the mental health stigma. They offer groups, groups for LGBTQIA, Black men, Black women. And one of the things they're doing is trying to help break the stigma of mental health to help heal the society and the community. So the impact of racism on mental health, it can cause people to feel disconnected and lonely, and second guess things, decreased hope in the future, justice or government, staying in increased survival mode, decreased trust, worry, increased risk of depression and anxiety, trauma both from present and triggering past instances, and generational trauma, the existential question of how can the world be so cruel, and panic. And as we know, when it comes to racism, you have your overt, socially unacceptable, as it says, racism, lynching, hate crimes, blackface, N-word. But then there's a covert, the socially acceptable ones. And these are things that we all have seen. And some of these are microaggressions that we'll get into a little bit later, the wearing costumes of, BIPOC community, English only initiatives, denial of racism. You're so articulate, the fetishization of BIPOC community, not challenging racist jokes, racial profiling. The list goes on and on. And in racism, there's 3 levels of racism. There's individual, institutional, and cultural. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about how Jewish Americans and Japanese Americans are affected by historical trauma as well. Sorry, I need to take a drink. So Jewish Americans suffer from historical trauma as a result of the Holocaust. It has been stated in Jewish culture, whether the trauma is a result from the diaspora, the Holocaust, or other displacement, children of survivors are often expected to stand for more than themselves. When I was studying this and I was reading up on that, I was like, well, what does, that mean, stand for more than themselves? So I reached out to a friend of mine who was Jewish, and she said to me that there's often, even within the Jewish community, that survivor guilt, especially if you're a descendant of the Holocaust. What she said to me is you're expected to lead the charge, to be the one to continue to carry on the family. And you have a lot of stress on being not necessarily perfect, but you can't fail. She said there's a lot of anxiety because of that, because you always have to be strong because we survived. Because survival was all or nothing during the Holocaust, they're expected at times to continue to be that way. Jewish Americans and Japanese Americans, like Native Americans and African Americans, lost their homes, their possessions. They were raped, separated from their families, forced to give up their heritage and their ethnicity in order to survive. They were placed in camps and had to survive, fought to survive. Many of them suffer from low self-esteem to avoidance or overachieving and body image as well too. Reminders of the trauma can be very triggering for them. It was reported that after 9/11, the call to round up suspicious Muslim Americans was a reminder to Japanese Americans about how they were treated after Pearl Harbor. So why do we need to understand historical trauma? It is important for us to understand historical trauma because the way these different affected groups respond has a significant effect in our communities. We as leaders in our communities, laymen, human service workers, teachers, etc., need to know how to respond. We need to study it because of the impact that it has had on our communities. Native Americans have said to be having the highest suicide rate, highest rate of domestic violence, highest rate of child maltreatment. African Americans have significant mistrust of police, internalized anger and aggression within the culture, high levels of family stress, child maltreatment, substance abuse, high levels of crime, poverty, underemployment, illiteracy, and gang violence. And it also can play out in sexism and socially accepted misogyny. Understanding historical trauma is extremely important if you're working in a human service agency. If you're working with families and cultures that do not look like you, you have to understand what happened to them, where they came from, because it might give you a clear picture as to some of the things that you're seeing and experiencing now. Again, like the example that I gave, where sometimes we come in the homes and we see that the kids are parentified. That's passed down from generation to generation. Another thing that I like to talk about is that how when you go into a lot of African American communities, a whooping is something that has been passed down from slavery time because, if a slave tried to escape, the slave master would whip them when they come back so that they would mind. That was something that became ingrained in our brains, and that was things that we would do to our children to make them mind. And then when you have like a report of like a social worker coming in and saying, you can't do this, that's sitting there looking at them and they're like, well, this is something that I have learned for years. This is how we're taught to mind. So understanding the background of where that comes from, and then helping provide that education of why that is not okay, and not just going in and saying, you're not supposed to whip your kids, because there's already this significant level of mistrust. Because most times when people are coming in from social service agencies, county workers, you're there to help. They see you as the enemy, especially if you are a person that is white, because they feel like you're coming in to do nothing but find something against me and then take my kids away from me. And the belief in that is often backed up by what we see, because those of us that work in the field have often noted that a person of color tends to be involved with child protective services for years for some of the same things that their white counterparts have done, who have often not had those services for very long. There's also been research that shows that it can take multitude of calls for a person that is white before CPS gets involved for an incident where if it happens in a person of color's family, they're instantly involved. So some of those scenarios that are happening still provides for them like this, yes, this mistrust, this is not okay. We have to be mindful of that distrust of majority of the groups or government programs. We have to deliver more programs to reduce the family stress, child abuse and neglect, substance misuse, and mental health challenges and domestic violence. Build that trust that providers can be respectful and cognizant of different reactions to traumatic events within communities. And understanding also too that some things that you can do as a non-person of color, a person of color cannot do. I remember we were having a consultation once, and someone said, I have this client and the mom's always struggling to get the kid to school and they don't want to get up. And I told them, well, if they don't want to get up, just send them in their pajamas, send them without their boots. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, a Black parent wouldn't be able to do that, because if they did, CPS would instantly be called on them. But me being the only person of color at that time sitting at the table, I didn't feel like I could step up and say that. So I sat quietly. But as I grown and start to find my voice and trying to help people understand, especially when working with people of color, I said, we have to be mindful about the things that we encourage parents to do. I understand we're working with them and we're trying to teach kids consequences, but the world doesn't view it the same when you're a person of color and when you're a white person. We also have to understand that it has an impact on psychological and physical health. And as Dr. DeGrasse said, in working with communities of color, you are dealing with multi-generational trauma, and you need to be sensitive to the way in which people move through the world if you're trying to help them. You have to tread lightly and watch and listen. So how does slavery still play a role in our lives today? As I said before, during slavery times, beatings were normalized and has since been normalized as a form of discipline in the African-American community. African-American women were forced to care for the slave owners' children first and their children last. So siblings are forced to care for siblings and become parentified. And I know during my work, when I often would get county referrals, one of the things that often came up when it was families of colors was like, the older sibling is always taking care of the kids. And I'm just like, yeah, that's a cultural thing. That's what's been passed along for us. I remember being the oldest grandchild and having to help take care of the younger ones way early at an age that we probably should not have been doing it, but that's what we did as a culture. Dreams were cut down. Like a Black person can't be a lawyer, and parents or others are still cutting down dreams today. Like we said before, rare to hear I love you, and it's okay for boys to cry. Burying and non-acknowledgement of rapes and molestation. Black babies who are severely emotionally neglected continue to pass this down into our legacies, generation after generation. It has been noted that the esteem of the African-American woman has been reduced to her usefulness. Many systems that were started in slavery to keep African Americans disenfranchised still exist today. I think a common thing, especially after what happened with George Floyd, is that you kept hearing people say is the system is broken, the system is broken. But in reality, the system is not broken. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And like Dr. DeGrasse said, we have to educate and we have to dismantle and rebuild those systems because it is doing what it's designed to do. It still has those underlying roots there. And in order to make that change, we have to provide education. It's no longer just, I can be an ally. You have to be an ally and get understanding and work together and dismantle. That's where you hear the cries of defund the police. It's not saying we don't want police in there, but it's saying that there needs to be new education. There needs to be different criteria. I believe someone said, it takes more to get your license to cut hair than it does, to become a police officer. So why must we heal? To understand how we heal, we must first understand why we need to heal. We need to heal because we have to be able to stop the cycle of intergenerational trauma. We need to heal to stop being victimized by the systems and institutions that have inflicted us in the past, to be able to stop the cycle of racial injustice from continuing. And as Dr. DeGrasse stated, the internal and external forces have cumulatively produced deeply embedded wounds left over from generations of unaddressed and unresolved mental, emotional, and physical abuse. Excuse me, just gotta take a drink. So how do we heal? To heal, we not only have to heal our minds, but we also need to heal our bodies as well. Unfortunately, sometimes it's very hard to assess healing because BIPOC continue to face hardships and discriminations on a daily basis. We need to not only change the system, but we need to, as we said, dismantle the system. We have to look at the damage that has been done and impacted on the individual, family, community, and society. We have to disclose and let go of secrets, hurt feelings, and resentments and grudges. We have to help build generational wealth, create positive routines, and create stability. Dr. Uri had stated that poverty is a major challenge, but it does not have to become a predictor of bad health. I bring up health again because health and bad eating habits continue to be passed down and can cause health issues such as shorter lifespans in African Americans and even in Native Americans and Japanese Americans. So if you think about it, the cultures that they came from, wasn't necessarily eating, some of the foods that we eat, but what they were given was the scraps that were left over, and they learned how to make things from it. I don't know if you have Netflix, but there's a show on there called High on the Hog, and it really talks a lot about how the foods that are consumed by the BIPOC community, how it got started, where it came from, and the role that it played, during slavery and times of that, and in how it, passes down history, but how we also need to step away from those things because, as we know, cardiovascular disease runs high in African American communities, cutting their life short. We need to change zoning laws as well, too, as how we help heal. And I know you're probably thinking, how does zoning laws help healing with historical trauma? Because the way the laws are zoned, if you think about it, when you go into a suburb community, you probably have to go miles and miles and miles before you see things like a liquor store and fast food restaurants. They're probably in most of those communities, they have that one strip where you find everything at. But once you get, further into the communities, you don't see it. In communities of people of color, you see it, a liquor store every couple of blocks, a fast food place every couple of blocks. That is continuing to perpetuate this thing of we got to have alcohol. We have to eat this bad food, and all it's doing is shortening people's lifespans. We have to take back our power and learn to build our communities and self-esteem and rebuild families. So now, because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to show the video on microaggressions, but we're going to talk a little bit about how microaggressions are tied into historical trauma as well, too. But first, I'll pause and see if there's any questions that need to be answered. If there's questions in the Q&A.
Yes, there are a few questions for you. One attendee is asking, I feel like BIPOC folks are always expected to be resilient or encouraged to be. Are there moments or spaces BIPOC can have space to not be resilient? If so, how do we provide this space?
I honestly, I think that is something that is a work in progress. There's actually a book that was written now called Black Fatigue. And then there's another one that I was reading called, oh, I'm blanking on it now, but it's about the burden that Black women feel about always having to be strong and always having to be resilient, and working on giving the space to say, you know what, I'm just not really resilient right now. I can't be strong. And you're absolutely correct. It's often always said, you know, you're resilient, you're strong. And I know even in groups that I have been a part of, not as a clinician, but been a part of as a consumer, that's often what comes up is like, I'm always told to be strong. And sometimes I just can't be strong. When can I have that time to just say, I feel weak, I need help? And I think that that's something that's being developed still, because a lot of the times, if you're saying I'm weak, I need this, then you're looked at as someone that they can't rely on. And you have to be that backbone.
There are a few questions here about books and things that you would recommend for individuals to teach themselves and learn more about these topics. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so if you're able to access the PowerPoint at the end, I do have a list of books that I do recommend, some movies to watch and some podcasts to listen to. But off the top of my head, I would definitely say reading the book Black Fatigue. I know a lot of people go with, you know, white fragility and how to be an anti-racist, which are also very good. There is a book about Black mental health. I would definitely recommend reading My Grandmother's Hands by Resman, because that is, and he actually, if you go to his webpage, he actually has some courses on there that I would highly recommend if you're working with people of color to take those courses, or just even if you're just trying to educate yourself more about it, I would definitely recommend taking part in that. And Dr. DeGry actually has her book, The Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and she also actually does a training as well too that I would recommend.
Okay, great. We did get a number of questions of if you're willing to share your PowerPoint slides. So it sounds like you are, and we can post those on the conference website after the conference is finished.
We'll do some updating to them. So I'll try to get the most updated version to them, but they do have it on there. And again, like I said, there's books on there, movies to watch. One thing I do often recommend for people to do is, you know, find someone in your community that is, I don't necessarily say they have to be an expert, but someone that has a good understanding, and invite them to be a part of your book club while you're reading and discussing. Because if your book club is all, you know, people that are white, you know, you're getting the white perspective of it. But, you know, even just having someone from that community that can help lead those discussions, and they may have questions that you didn't think about that can help you to further address and understand what you're reading and processing.
Another question, do you think there is more efficacy in private community services versus government agencies in terms of dealing with racialized trauma?
I do think that there is a difference, because I think in private agencies, they have more control over, you know, some of their rules and things of that nature. You know, I do think that unfortunately for a lot of the government ones, we're still working off of, you know, statutes that were put in place in the 50s and 60s, and they're now just currently being challenged, and there's now changes that's coming about, but it's not easy changes. Like I said before, the Emmett Till lynching law, it's, you know, that they went after that in 1955, and here we are in 2022, and that still isn't passed. And I do think that in private, you know, agencies, they have the ability to enact changes a lot quicker. You know, I've worked with a lot of government agencies in the work that I do, and you can see where people want to do things different, but they're, you know, governed by those rules and laws as well.
What can non-BIPOC people do to best acknowledge and ease the emotional labor that goes along with continually being put in the role of the spokesperson for their racial background?
Mm-hmm. And I can definitely tell you that is something that face a lot. And one of the biggest things that I can say is it's not looking to them to educate you. I think oftentimes when you're working in an environment where there may only be one or two people of color, they internally think I have to take on this role of educating them about what's okay and what's not okay, and not looking to them to do that. I do think if you're working at a place that doesn't have a DEI role there, saying and encouraging your board to say, hey, we need to get this developed so that we can get some outside agencies and outside people coming in and providing that work and providing that support. But I do think oftentimes when there's only one or two people of color, it's just an unconscious thing to look to them to be the ones to provide that education. And if you're feeling like, oh, I'm not sure if I said the right thing, having those courageous conversations. I do think sometimes we're often afraid to talk and to ask things. And I do believe that you can't know and start the change if you don't know how to start the conversation. And sometimes the conversation is just as simple as, I just want to ask you a question because I'm just not sure. And if you're like, I don't want to be the one to provide this information, that's okay.
Similar to that, someone is asking if you have any suggestions for clinicians that are struggling to connect with BIPOC clients who are distrustful of the system.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I would suggest doing is that, if you have someone in your agency who is willing to provide some consultation, that's a person of color, is, having them, because it's sometimes just even in the approach, even in the language. I think one thing that we've learned and acknowledged in the work that we've begun with our we call it IDEAB at Orion, but it's DEI work. It's just that even sometimes the language that we use can set up that barrier. It's even sometimes in our appearance. If we're coming in and we're dressed in like business pants and business suits, you're already setting that tone of, I'm above you. So sometimes it's even coming a little bit more casual and meeting them where they are at. And if there's no one in your agency, I would look at hiring a consultant that can come in and just work with you guys, just like once a month. And they can look at things like your paperwork. Is your paperwork inclusive? Is your paperwork acknowledging things? And if you are working with families and you're like, I'm just really struggling to connect, and you can talk with them. I can say for me, in my instance, I've always been one at my agency that's been open to people to come and talk to me. I had an example of one family, and it was two white women going in with a Black family, and they were like, we are just not connecting. And they asked me about it, and I could tell they were very nervous to come and talk with me about it. And I said, it's okay. I'd rather you talk to me because we don't want them to further feel like I can't stand therapy. People aren't here to help me because you're coming in and you're causing trauma to them and you're not realizing that you're doing that. And in the conversation that we had, I gave them some tips to use and things to do, and it turned completely around for them. So I think having someone that you can consult with would be a great tool.
Definitely. And then just one last question before you jump back in with microaggressions. What do you mean by healing the body as a component of healing from racialized trauma?
Healing the body, because a lot of the times we can feel our trauma and stuff through our bodies. If you look at certain people, obesity runs high, and that's just because we carry a lot of stress, the cortisol levels, the pain. So you got to also be able to heal your body. You have to learn how to eat better, learn how to manage that stress so that it isn't coming back off into your body. Because as we know, it's not just healing the mind, you have to heal the overall piece and understanding how it all plays a role together.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Folks, please keep sending in those questions. And if we have a chance after Niquanna's finished with this next section, we'll get some answers for you.
I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I know I want to go through microaggressions and try to get to implicit biases. So I'm going to try to run through this pretty quickly, and I apologize for that. But again, you should hopefully have access to my slides. So when we talk about microaggressions, we hear things such as, where were you born? You speak good English. You are a credit to your race. When I look at you, I don't see color. a white woman clutching her purse when an African American or Hispanic American approaches. There's only one race, the human race. I'm not a racist. I have several Black friends. As a woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority. These are all examples of microaggressions. I think the biggest microaggression that we often hear is when I look at you, I don't see color. Or people say, I'm colorblind. The reason why that is one of the biggest microaggressions is because you're taking away who they are as a person. A microaggression is a form of contemporary violence. They're current events and often covert in nature. They occur on a daily basis, are chronic, and affect the subgroups that are most commonly affected by historical trauma. There are three types of microaggressions. There's the micro insult, which is characterized by communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's heritage or identity. There's micro invalidations, where communications that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. And then there's the micro assault. It's an explicit racial derogation characterized primarily by verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt the intended victim. So these are other examples of microaggression. The alien in their own land. The microaggression, where are you from? The message, you're not American. Description of intelligence, you are so articulate, meaning it's saying that people of color are generally not as intelligent as whites. It is unusual for someone of your race to be intelligent. The color blindness, when I look at you, I don't see color. The message is denying a person of color's racial and ethnic experiences and saying you must assimilate and accurate to the dominant culture. Criminality and assumption of criminality. Denial of individual racism. I'm not racist. I have several Black friends who says I am immune to racism because I have friends of color. Myth of meritocracy. I believe that the most qualified person gets the job. People of color are given extra unfair benefits because of their race. Pathologizing cultural values and communication styles. Asking a Black person, why do you have to be so loud, animated? Just calm down. Again, that message is assimilate to the dominant culture. The second-class citizen, where a person of color is mistaken for a service worker, or the phrase, you people. It says people of color are servants to whites and they couldn't possibly occupy high status positions. Environmental microaggressions, overcrowding of public schools in communities of color, where people of color don't and shouldn't value education. I often have seen that, coming from living in Milwaukee, I look at how our school system is in certain areas, and now living in Janesville, which is a predominantly white town and often referred to as in the past has been a sundown town, and seeing, walking in these schools and they're looking like college buildings. And I go back to my community and our schools have not had an upgrade since I was, there for elementary school. The kids having access to Chromebooks and iPads, and some of the schools barely have access to all the books that are needed for the kids. Second-class citizen, I think, often still very much happens, especially, when a person of color is in a higher role, when you go, in a job, often when people see they're like, oh, you're the supervisor, like you couldn't, be in a role like that. So implicit biases is also important to know and understand when we're talking about historical trauma. So what is an implicit bias? Like, we have a bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference or aversion to a person or group of people. Thus, we use the term implicit bias to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. Now, could you be a non-racist person and have an implicit bias? Yes, because it is unconscious knowledge. Different implicit biases are race and ethnicity, gender, LGBTQIA+, ability, age, and so forth. We need to identify and evaluate our own biases. Be aware and more proactive in being inclusive. And especially if you're an ally, I do recommend that you take the implicit association test. The link is there. And the reason I recommend taking that test is because sometimes, even in being an ally, we can cause harm and trauma because our implicit biases sometimes may come out in peak and play a role in the things that we're doing, and we're not meaning for them to do. So sometimes understanding these biases that we have can further help the work that we do. Under the implicit bias, test, there's several, but I would highly recommend, doing the race and gender and ageism. I would recommend doing them all, but those three would be the top ones, and the LGBTQ I would recommend as well too. So how do we move forward? One of the biggest ways to move forward is to allow healing. As previously stated, many communities of color have had their land and history taken from them, and they need a space to reweave their personal narratives and a place to be heard and validated. So when you're looking at, if you're a therapist and you're like, I want to open a private practice, try to make sure your practice is accessible, and not just financially accessible, but accessible by, okay, can clients reach me by bus if they can't afford a car and can't afford an Uber? Make sure it's like inclusive and welcoming. When they go to look at your website, are they seeing nothing but white faces and white language, or are they seeing diversity? Be honest. Society likes to say that racism and discrimination no longer exists, but unfortunately, that is not reflective of our current situation. Incorporate culturally and trauma-informed work in education. Be mindful of unresolved grief and distrust of majority groups or government programs. Providers need to build trust, and that can be done by being respectful and cognizant of different reactions to traumatic events within communities and focus on community strengths and resilience. Cultural competency. I know that, depending if you're younger, you probably get that in school right now, but I think cultural competency is something that everyone should reevaluate and redo every 2 years. It's understanding the cultures that we serve and understanding the impact that these events have had on their lives. Breaking the stigma around mental health, being out in those communities, it's not enough to just say I'm an ally, but getting your hands dirty, for lack of better words, going out there, doing the hands-on work with them. Make sure that they understand that seeing a therapist to resolve their grief is not a sign of weakness. Connectedness is a big one. We need to connect to people again, gather around our elders and share our narratives. I often say that technology today has made us so not connected, and unfortunate this pandemic is not helping. But if we can start building that connectedness again, change the narrative, focus on the positive, the good things, identify the strength. We want to talk about the trauma, but we also need to talk about, the joys, the positives and stuff as well too. Telling and retelling about traditions that are positive, that can help lessen the impact. As human service agencies and humans in general, we need to make sure that communities that have experienced historical trauma have a sense of purpose, optimism and hope, positive religious experience, and access to affordable healthcare and housing. So some key concepts to remember, and I'm sorry I'm going a lot faster, is that it can have an impact on psychological and physical health. Historical trauma is a multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural group. Descendants who have not directly experienced a trauma can still exhibit those signs and symptoms. Communities that have been subjected to historical trauma may believe that systems do not support them. When working with members of affected communities, gain a fuller understanding of the client's historical and community context. Build alliances with local respected individuals. And remember, not every member of a group has the same response to current or past traumatic events. So we don't want you to always go in with your trauma lens. Go in and look at each situation for as it is. And one of the reasons we need to understand is so things like this don't keep happening, like Ahmaud Arbery, Andre Hill, Atiana Jefferson, Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and George Floyd. Historical trauma did not happen overnight, and we will not heal from it overnight. It will take time, patience, and understanding. But as Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart stated, the best way to heal is to confront it, understand it, release the pain of it, and transcend it. Then here's a list of some movies to watch, books to read, and some podcasts to listen to. Sorry I had to rush through the last part of it, but I wanted to be able to get you guys out on time.
No problem. Perfect timing. So many thanks to you, Niquanna, for sharing your time, expertise, and all of this valuable information with us today. And thank you to everyone in attendance for being a part of this event and for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Before you leave today, please fill out the evaluation form. I put a link to the evaluation in the Q&A section earlier in the session. If you don't have time to fill it out now, you can also watch for an email coming later today with a link to complete the evaluation later as well. And for those of you who requested CEUs when registering, you will receive those in a few weeks as well. Please be sure that you're registered for the conference next week. We hope to see you then on February 4th for more dynamic content. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.